Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I know it's a gloomy day. Okay. So I'm just going to run through some terms that will come up a lot in the panel tonight, and we'll jump right off the bat with the big reason that we're all here. So race. So can somebody just shout out for me how they would define race? Sorry? Color. Anybody else? Phenotype. So you're saying biological then, right? Okay. So we're saying it's not biological. So race is a socially constructed system for classifying people into groups. But what does it mean that it's socially constructed? Does that mean it's not real? Does that mean it's not real? So what does that mean? It means that human biological races do not exist. And we're saying that they don't exist because human variation is very complex and it doesn't actually correspond to the racial categories that have been created, right? So what that really means is that there's more racial diversity within the racial groups that we have defined than there are between them. So within the group called Black people, for instance, there's more racial variation within the group called Black people than between what is called Black people and white people. So except for identical twins, we're all genetically different from each other. So another term you hear used to classify people is ethnicity, right? And an ethnic group is a category of people identified with each other based on similarities such as common language, ancestry, cultural practices, or national experience. So again, ethnicity is not biologically based, right? It's based on shared traits, and usually those shared traits are associated with some kind of defined culture. So what is culture? Can anybody tell me what they think culture is? Or just yell out something that you would say is part of your culture. Sorry? I didn't hear. Cuisine, okay. Anything else? Religion? Or what would you say is American culture? So culture is the social organization of meaning. It is not static, it's always in process, it's always being made, right? We're not born with a particular culture. It's a system of knowledge, values, beliefs, patterns of behavior, objects and institutions that are created, learned, and shared by groups of people. So again, culture is not biological, you're not born with a particular culture. And it's the things that we think of as normative, that we take for granted. So how do you get culture? If you're not born with it, how do you get? Sorry? Yeah, it's taught to you, right? So there's a term inculturation, and that's exactly what inculturation means, right? It's the way that we get culture, and culture is learned as part of a group process, and it's done unconsciously and consciously. There's also the term acculturation. And acculturation is the process of adopting cultural traits or social patterns from another group. So when groups come into contact and you adopt cultural traits from another group that isn't your own. But how do these groups come into contact? Anybody? How do we process that people move? So migration, which is a big topic now, as ever. So why do people move? Why do people migrate? Jobs is a big one. Shelter. War. So is migration new? You wouldn't think so, listen to the election, but yes. So the movement, migration is the movement from people from one place to another, and it's for their settling either temporarily or permanently. And it's not new. So just to recap some of the big movements that we've had in history. So the movement of Homo erectus out of Africa across to Eurasia. So you may have heard before that the human species originated on the continent of Africa and then spread out from there. So that's one of the big migrations. Then there's also the Indo-European migration that happened between 4000 to 1000 BCE. And then another big migration is the migrations in Europe. So people moving to Western Europe, moving to Eastern Europe and populating from there and then moving and into the Americas. So then came this movement called modernity, right? So people are moving, or they're moving for particular reasons, like for agriculture, for food sources, for environmental reasons, and things like that. But then comes modernity. So modernity is this moment in post-medieval Europe, so about the 14th, 15th century, where a set of socio-cultural norms and attitudes and practices arise that change the way people completely see the world, right? And this involved things that may sound familiar to you today about how we see the world. So the rejection of tradition, the prioritization of the individual, prioritization of ideas of like freedom, form and equality, faith in science and technology and progress, and faith in human perfectibility. So this all sounds kind of familiar, right? Because these are kind of the rhetoric that's going around now, also around the elections. So with modernity, a new economic system comes into place, capitalism. And does anybody know what capitalism, like what capitalism entails? Exactly, making a profit. So capitalism is a socio-economic system where the means of producing goods are owned by a small minority of people. The majority of people sell their labor to that person to produce goods, and the minority of people who own the means of production make the profit. And one of the earliest forms of capitalism is mercantile capitalism, right? So this is a form of trade where merchant houses backed by private finances exchange valuable goods and debt. And mercantile capitalism really took off in Europe during the 16th century. Why did it take off during the 16th century? Sorry? Yes, exploration and settlement and colonialism in the New World. So again, people are moving. So colonialism is the extension of a nation's rule over territory beyond its borders. And the colonizing nations usually take control of the resources, the labor, and the markets of the colonial territory, and then they impose their socio-cultural practices, religion, linguistic structure on the conquered population, right? So one of the kind of, when you think of colonialism, what's the other thing you immediately associate with it? Yeah, and yeah, Columbus, and then slavery. Somebody said slavery. So the North Atlantic slave trade. So this kind of time-lapse video is showing movement. So you see slavery mainly happens in the New World between 15th and 19th century. So at the beginning, there's slow movement where enslaved people are being transported from Africa to the New World, from Western Africa to the New World. And you see it start to speed up. So during this period, about 17 million slaves were transported to the New World specifically. And that doesn't count people who died on the way, people who got lost, who got killed during trade and wars, or other slaves that moved elsewhere, not to the New World. And most of these slaves were going to North America, the Caribbean, and with a large population going to Brazil. So you see how fast it starts like flying. So another aspect of colonialism that we can't forget is settler colonialism, right? So not only what happened to enslaved Africans during this period, but what happened to indigenous people in the New World during this period. So settler colonialism is when foreigners move into a region, control, and or depopulate the native inhabitants by a variety of means, right? So genocide, so killing off the population, putting them into indentureship, enslavement as well, and the settlers take over the land of previous residents. And this is exactly what happened in America. Also, there's settler colonialism on the African continent. So just to recap all the things that we've gone through so far, the 15th century marked the inauguration of a global system of political and economic and social relations in which all the continents and oceanic routes were involved. So the beginning of a global capitalist system and a movement of populations to facilitate this capitalism. And with that, the old and new world were linked, and that began the common project of defining modern racial groups. So in order to rationalize slavery and imperialism and why some people could be enslaved and others cannot, we have the development of racial groups happening, right? So this isn't to say that different didn't exist before this period, but to say it wasn't the racial categories we know today, it wasn't concretized. There were other forms of difference working, but this is when we start to have the global racial categories forming. So with this, we see that race was actually, the beginnings of race, what we know as race today, started in the slave trade, in imperialism. So you have diverse groups of Africans being all categorized as Negroes, diverse groups of indigenous people all being categorized as Indos. And then we have African descendants and Indians and native people who are categorized as Indians being seen as different kinds of humans, according to if their soul could be saved, right? So for African, they had no soul, so they can't be saved, so they're lesser human. Indigenous people were seen like they could be possibly Christianized. So this really laid the foundation for the work that was done in the 19th and 20th century to continue to solidify racial categories, and which you'll hear more about when they start to talk about the Morton Skull collection. But with more movement in the 19th century, where you have increased industrialization and more people moving, and then you have immigrations of groups to the US, people are trying to understand how to categorize the other, right? So they continue to decide which racial categories should be solidified, who belongs to what racial categories. Are all people white? Are Jewish whites different from Western European whites? So all these things start to be negotiated in the 19th and 20th century according to immigration. So some key takeaway points, and probably not the usual rhetoric with capitalism, that slavery was central to modern capitalism. And the racial hierarchies and racism are also central to capitalism. So racism isn't just a feeling, but actually something that's historically grounded in an economic system that was developed in the New World. Okay. So those are just some of the key points that will help you to just travel through the conversation. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Heaney to the stage, Assistant Professor of History at Penn State.